Can I say, first of all, on behalf of the Secretary General of the United Nations, who's asked me to speak on his behalf, first of all today, that he wishes to send his personal best wishes, his congratulations on this huge new campaign that has been mounted by Education International, 30 million teachers in 170 million countries, and he wishes not only to applaud what you're doing, but to congratulate you on the timing of this new campaign, just over 2 years before we have to complete the Millennium Development Goals. To emphasize the importance of access and quality to education is the most important thing that teachers around the world can do. And he looks forward, he has told me, to working with you in Education First, to raise the banner for education and to make the world realize that unless we invest more in education and unless we are able to hire more teachers, then we will have generations of young people who are unemployed and unemployable. And it is our duty to tell the whole of the world that education must, as he has said in his campaign, come first. Now, everywhere I go in the world, when I see young girls and boys in need, I see teachers determined to help them. Whenever I see young children who are laid low by child labor and the slavery of having to work when they should be at school, I see teachers who are desperate to rescue them. Whenever I see young girls who are forced into early marriage against their will and denied the right to an education, I see teachers determined to free them and release them. And whenever I see girls discriminated against, as we knew happened with Malala in Pakistan, girls who put their lives at risk for the right to education, I see teachers determined to save them. So I want to thank Education International for its work in every country of the world in promoting not only the needs of teachers, but the right of every child to education. And your internationalism is such that you see very clearly that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And when the strong help the weak, it makes us all stronger. Now, I was once a teacher myself, and I know that the profession of teaching, it stands for integrity, it stands for impartiality, objectivity, the pursuit of truth, the search for knowledge, and I found that these were all the qualities I had to leave behind when I went into politics. And my wife Sarah wrote a book when she asked people all over the world, who apart from their relatives, who was the greatest influence on their lives? And almost invariably, people who spoke about what and who had influenced their lives most said it was an individual teacher. And none of us ever forget the teacher we had when we were young. And when it came to perhaps the most famous football manager in the world, Alex Ferguson, who's a friend of mine, he said that it wasn't a football star or a football manager or a football coach that was the greatest influence on making him the best manager in the world. It was a primary school teacher who had inspired him to do his best at every point. And we know that teachers unlock the potential of children who otherwise would be unfulfilled. We know that teachers can bridge the gap and help bridge the gap between what children are and what they have it in themselves to become. Some of you may have heard of the French writer who said, you can survive for 30 days without food, and 8 days without water, and 3 minutes without air, but you cannot survive for a second without hope. And it is teachers that give young people the hope that they can build a better future. So today, on World Teachers' Day, as we're planning this campaign for the months ahead, it is important that we honor the status and the professionalism, the dedication and the commitment of millions of teachers around the world who, far beyond the call of duty, are helping young children in some of the most difficult and dire circumstances realize the potential. And I also want to thank teachers, because in the last 30 or 40 years, when other causes have been in fashion, when sometimes the needs of education have been neglected, when sometimes other issues have become far more prominent and people have thought that you could shift resources from education and it would be an easy way of making a better world, you have stood firm for the right of every child to education, but more than that, for universal, free, compulsory, quality education. And I think you are being proven right in everything that you have stood for over these years. And whether it has been fighting back after the Pakistan floods or the tsunami in Asia, or whether it was the Beslan massacre or the attempted massacre of children and teachers at these schools, you have said that in every situation, in every circumstance in which people face difficulty, we must uphold, particularly in conflict countries and in broken down regimes, the right of every child to continue their education despite the circumstances in which they face. But you have stood firm, and two big changes have happened, I believe, over the last year or two, that make it imperative that we now build on the successes that you have had to fight for universal education in our generation. And the first big change is that people are coming to realize that if a nation is to be successful, any nation is to be prosperous, then it has to invest in education. Look at all the scientific, academic, professional work about why nations fail and why nations succeed. And they write about culture, and the difference between some nations failing and succeeding are the institutions and the quality of them. And they write about whether you've got resources or not, what your geographical position is, the location in relation to the rest of the trade in the world. But increasingly, the academic science is coming to understand the truth that you have always understood, that no nation will succeed in the modern world unless it invests in education. And no nation will move from a low-income or a middle-income country to being a high-income country unless it invests in quality education. And I do believe that the significance of your technology initiative with companies and with governments, where you are saying that you do not see technology as a threat to the future of education, but a means by which you can improve education, the teacher being the sage on the stage perhaps, but the guide by your side, and technology empowering young people through tuition as well as through technology to make the best of their potential. And it is one way, by creating an online global education platform that you now support, that the work of teachers can be enhanced and your professionalism extended so that we can get to every child, so that even in the most remote area, the poorest country, the least promising circumstances in the world, the poorest pupil may have access to the best library materials in any continent, in any part of the world. So I applaud your commitment that to build a successful economy of the future in each and every individual country, you will not only mobilize the case for investment in education, but put technology at the service of teachers, not replacing teachers, but technology used by teachers to give people a better education. But you know, the second big change over the last year, and I think you all know it from what you've seen in the newspapers and on television, and we must build on this, is that young boys and girls themselves are standing up for their right to quality education. And they're not prepared to accept second best. They want quality education in the arguments they put. And I believe that Malala Yousafzai, that young girl who sacrificed her life, who risked her life and was prepared to sacrifice her life fighting for education, she has done more to speak up for the rights of girls to education in a few short months than millions of men have done in centuries when they should have been campaigning for the rights of girls to education. And what I see around the world is what I would call a civil rights struggle. Girls particularly no longer prepared to accept that they should be passive and acquiescent and allow other people to determine their future free of education. Girls fighting back, as in Bangladesh, with child marriage-free zones against being forced into child marriage. The Global March for Labour in India and elsewhere, releasing young children from bondage and slavery and forced work. And all these campaigns are showing that a civil rights struggle is on in our generation to establish for the first time that every single girl and every single boy has the right to education. And it is something upon which I believe we must now build. And so what should we now do? Faced with the reality that no country can succeed without investing in education, and faced with this new demand from young people themselves that their needs for quality education have got to be taken seriously, I believe we've got to recognize that in these next 2 years, we have a unique opportunity, if we work together, to make a huge difference. Yes, it is true that aid is being cut at the moment, and we've got to fight that. And yes, is it true that no country that I know of will have its leaders make education the priority unless we force them to do so. But yes, it is possible if we form a constructive partnership with all those people who've got an interest in securing education for every child, and quality education at that, then we can make an enormous difference over the next few years. And that is why, in the last year, I have tried to look at each country that is failing to meet the universal target, look at them one by one, get the leaders of these countries round the table. But what I would like you to do is, before we have the next meetings with these leaders, we step up the domestic pressure on them in all of these countries to take the needs of education as a priority seriously. And we need to mobilize business. We need to mobilize faith groups. We need to mobilize young people. We need to mobilize the teachers' organizations that you represent yourself. We need to mobilize the whole of civil society. And if we can create a mood for change in these countries, then I believe that despite what has been happening in the decisions about resources, we can force these countries into realizing what we know already, that education is not only the way to unlock individual opportunity, it is not only the only way we can break the cycle of poverty, but it is also the way that individual nations who are poor can become prosperous and eliminate the poverty of their citizens in the future. Now, we are tested in almost every part of the world because of either prejudice against girls' education, child labor, child trafficking, child marriage, these obstacles preventing people going to school, but also because of the absence of teachers. And we heard these startling figures, and I pay tribute to the work that is done by UNESCO, Irina Bukova, and Pauline Rose at UNESCO, in showing us that we are 1.6 million short of the teachers we need even to get to the Millennium Development Goal of universal primary education in 2015, and millions more short of the numbers we need, the 5 million we need to get universal secondary education underway by 2030. But I believe if we can bring people together, we can put that case for additional resources and find that we have contributors to that. New donors, countries spending more themselves, a reallocation of resources from the things that you've been talking about today that are wasteful expenditure to good expenditure, and it is public pressure led by you and others that will make the difference. And we fight in every area. And today we think of 400,000 child refugees from Syria who are now in Lebanon, 1 million child refugees from the Syrian conflict who are now deprived of food, shelter, healthcare, and also education. And we've got to start establishing the principle that even in the most broken down area of the world, just as the Red Cross established a right to health, we have got to establish that there is also a right to education. And we can start immediately, because there is a plan, and Joe Bourne, who is here of UNICEF, has been involved in the last few days in drawing this up, to provide in Lebanon 400,000 places over a period of time for the number of refugees in that country, the child refugees who've been excluded from Syria but have no hope of education unless we do something about it. And by using the existing schools on a double shift system, we could start almost immediately, if we had the international finance to do so, to get these children to school, to give them the chance of an education, to stop them being a wasted generation, to stop them being deprived of their own childhood, and to stop them being deprived of hope. And I tell you, this is a testing time, because it is the worst humanitarian crisis of this century, and yet we have an opportunity to do something about it immediately to help children not only have food and shelter, but to have education. And I want us in these next few weeks to establish the right that every child, irrespective of borders, irrespective of boundaries between countries, has wherever they are the right to education in this world. Now, what are we fighting for in the end? It is not simply about the provision of education. It is about the equality of opportunity that every child should have. There is a story that some of you may have heard, that in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was asked by the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, who was the champion of international development, particularly for children, if he would meet him at the White House to hear what he had to say. And Ronald Reagan agreed to the meeting, and then the day that the meeting happened, he turned to his advisors and said, "Isn't this man from Sweden, isn't he a communist?" And his advisors said, "No, Mr. President, he's an anti-communist." And Ronald Reagan said, I don't care what kind of communist he is. And Ronald Reagan said to Olof Palme, do you want to abolish the rich? And he said, no, I want to abolish the poor. I want every single child in the world to have the chance to realize the potential to the full. And that surely is what this campaign about quality education is all about. Every single child in every part of the world should have by right the chance to realize the potential to the full. You know, in ancient Rome, when they used to have speeches given from rostrums like this, Cicero was the most famous orator of the day. And it used to be said of him that when he made a speech, people used to turn to each other after he sat down and they said to each other, great speech. But in ancient Greece, Demosthenes was also an orator. And when he spoke and sat down, people didn't turn to each other and say, great speech. They turned to each other and said, let's march. So let's march for quality education.